All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to those of us who are joining here in New York and all around the world. My name is Sunita Keimel, and I am the president and CEO of the Natural Resource Governance Institute. NRGI aims to help fossil fuel producing countries to make informed choices about their energy futures that protect the planet, strengthen their economies, and also, of course, create fairer societies ultimately. This work is very much grounded in the reality that the world must produce much less oil, natural gas, and coal starting now if we are to avoid climate catastrophe. As we are gathering here in New York for Climate Week, the imperative of managing fossil fuel production is, of course, top of mind for all of us. As the most recent UNEP production gap report shows, greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow, and fossil fuels still make up about 80% of the energy mix worldwide. Governments and companies around the world are still planning to produce more than double the supply of fossil fuels by 2030 that is compatible with the Paris Agreement. Getting back on track is absolutely crucial at this juncture. Efforts to cut fossil fuel consumption are at the absolute core of global climate efforts. But these alone are unlikely to keep warming under 1.5 C. Managed supply cuts are also needed, and this is where the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels can help. By providing us with information on reserves and how much coal, oil, and gas is being produced, how much it is likely to cost, and what it actually means in terms of the remaining carbon budget, the registry gives international researchers and investors the information that we need to have a truly sensible conversation on fossil fuel supply and the pace of decline. It also provides leaders and activists within fossil fuel producing countries with a valuable tool to be able to debate the risks, both economic and environmental, that is associated with their production plans. NRGI is so pleased to support Carbon Tracker on this crucial project because we believe that making this information available can help in three very distinct ways. First and foremost, national policymakers can understand the scope of the problem, and they can engage in more inclusive and participatory decision-making. Today, many producer countries continue to follow the same fossil fuel dependent pathways that they have for decades and are struggling to wrestle with the implication of what a managed decline really means for them, whether that's on tax revenues, on local business opportunities and employment, or on their national climate commitments. Engaging with affected parties can help lead to outcomes that are better for all stakeholders involved. More informed national debate might also help policymakers to avoid some of the risky bets that they're making, such as pouring public money into national oil company projects that will only break even if humanity exceeds its emission targets. In Nigeria, NRGI is working with a local NGO budget and with the Nigerian EITI Secretariat to support national dialogues on a future beyond oil that will examine questions like these. And the registry will no doubt provide useful insights to inform conversations like this that need to happen all around the world. Second, accountability actors can use production data to hold governments, companies, and others accountable to the commitments that they have made. And when producers fall short, civil society can facilitate market pressure, public shaming, or litigation in response. And finally, access to reliable data on production puts international stakeholders in a better place to cooperate to reach our shared goals. Globally inclusive dialogue is needed on important questions such as which countries should reduce production first. Many developing and emerging market producers with small carbon footprints are already calling on the wealthy, high-emitting producers to lead the decline and to help provide support for national transition plans. Comparable data on production and emissions can lead to a better understanding on what constitutes a managed, just, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. Today, we have the opportunity to hear more about what the registry is, what it does, and why it matters to the future of the planet. We're delighted to be joined by Mark Campanale, who's the founder and executive chairman of the Carbon Tracker Initiative, as well as Rob Schuerk, the executive director of Carbon Tracker North America. Mark and Rob will provide an overview of the registry before we hear from our distinguished panelists, which include Inger Andersen, executive director of the UN Environment Program, Birgit Schwenk, Director General for Energy from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and joining us remotely, Carol Muppet, President and CEO of the Center for the International Environmental Law. First, we have a video of support from the Honorable Simon Coffey, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Justice and Communications of the Government of Tuvalu.
Your Excellencies, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, aloha and warm Pacific greetings from Tuvalu. For more than 20 years, the international scientific community has been alerting the world to the danger of fossil fuel production. Fossil fuels are the main contributor to the climate crisis and have been responsible for 86% of carbon emissions in the last decade. The Paris Agreement sets the benchmark for international climate action through its global 1.5 degrees temperature goal. The agreement remains an important step in the right direction, a chance for humanity to correct course and salvage a sustainable future for all, especially those of us on the very front lines of the climate crisis. But as we have seen, we cannot rest on one victory alone, for even now we understand that there are those who seek to undermine these hard-won gains and whose policies and extractive industries detract from the spirit of Paris. Because as important as the Paris Agreement is, it is not sufficient. By limiting only fossil fuels emissions and not production, the Paris Agreement has allowed countries to support a proliferation of new coal, oil, and gas projects, whether directly or indirectly. We need to keep around 88% of fossil fuel reserves in the ground to keep global heating under 1.5. But current government production plans are leading to a major increase above that critical temperature limit. This is why, as one of many climate leaders from a Pacific nation experiencing the most severe impacts of climate change, I welcome the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels, the first ever fully public and accessible database to track oil, gas, and coal production worldwide. My friends, not only do we need to name the climate threat posed by fossil fuels production, but we must also quantify it in order to address it properly. Not only is it necessary to track emissions, but we must complement this by tracking fossil fuels production as well. Being able to assess how much coal, oil, and gas is being produced and where this production is occurring is key to understanding what climate actions we must take to avoid irreversible and catastrophic climate impacts. We now possess a tool that can assist in effectively ending coal, oil, and gas production. The Global Registry will help governments, companies, and investors make decisions to align their fossil fuel production with the 1.5 temperature limit and thus concretely prevent the demise of our island homes, as well as countries throughout our global community. We here in the Pacific, from government officials to members of the civil society to youth, communities, and leaders, have been making the case for mechanisms to address fossil fuel production for a very long time. We are only responsible for 0.03 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet we remain committed to doing our part for the common good of our planet and future generations. At the latest Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting, we declared as a region that the climate emergency leaves no choice but to take collective political action to end the world's deadliest dependence on fossil fuels. We see the need to end fossil fuels production as increasingly urgent. As governments, we can only show real climate leadership by demonstrating accountability, coherence, and alignment with our own commitments. The Paris Agreement marked one turning point in international climate governance. The Global Registry is another. This new tool will be essential to managing a global just transition away from fossil fuels and towards delivering climate justice by fostering genuine climate action to protect people's environments, livelihoods, health, and security, especially in the most vulnerable areas. Today, in the midst of the New York Climate Action Week and the United Nations General Assembly, the world is watching. And as COP27 approaches, the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels will ensure that governments are fully informed of how committed each member of our global community is to maintaining our goal of 1.5 to stay alive. Congratulations to all involved in creating and launching the registry, and I look forward to our continued partnership, the Pacific and for our planet. Paftailasi Tuvalu Matiatu.
Thank you so much to Minister Coffey. Now over to you, Mark and Rob.
Thank you very much. Delighted to see everybody here today. I want to thank Sunita for moderating today and to Inga for joining us from the UNEP. I know you've got a very busy schedule, and Birgit as well, representing the German Federal Ministry. So here we are in New York. I'm tell from my accent, I'm from London, I'm a Brit. The two global financial centers for the financing of the fossil fuel industry. When Carbon Tracker was launched 10 years ago, there were around 700 gigatons of CO2 in the reserves of companies listed on the London and the New York Stock Exchange. 10 years on, there's now 1,000 gigatons of CO2. I kind of joke with some of my funders, if you measure the success of a campaigning NGO, we would probably get a D, because the world has been blind to this. In all honesty, I got Carbon Tracker going when I was an analyst working for a fund management company, and I saw two companies IPOing. One was Xstrata, which is now Glencore, and in the 300-page IPO document, which I did read, they were just, and all the company did was coal. There were just 20 lines about climate change. And this, around the same year, was another company listing on London called Asia Energy. Well, if you know it, you know the company. It's changed its name, but they were building a large coal-fired power station in Bangladesh. And in the document they presented, they said, well, look at all the flooding in Bangladesh, but don't worry, the coal mine is right up there on the northeast. It will never get flooded. And it reminded me of all the really smart people in Wall Street that are completely disconnected from the real world that the ambassador from Tuvalu was describing. And in fact, since the last 10 years, there's been 2,500 coal, oil, and gas IPOs and secondaries in New York and in London that has raised nearly $600 billion. And it continues, and it continues. So what do we need to do to address it? That's really where the heart of the Global Registry, which Carbon Tracker has put together with our allies and colleagues and friends at Global Energy Monitor, led by Ted Neese, is to put in the public domain the information that allows investors and bankers and policymakers and regulators to actually see what is going on, see what is happening. But at the heart of it, it points to, as we've heard, the problem really with the Paris Agreement, if we can put it like that. I'm a huge fan. Is this an emissions reduction treaty? Reducing emissions means we don't have to talk about the challenging question of the production of fossil fuels. And that's why the two are operating in completely parallel worlds, as if the two are somehow disconnected. So why is this important? The forecasts that are used by the IEA and the scenarios produced by the IPCC are just that. They're forecasts and they're scenarios. But how do we truth it? The way we truth what will really happen is by looking at the investment plans of the banks like JP Morgan, Citigroup, and the many others are putting together the coal financing and the oil and gas financing. And when you look at their plans, you can see that we're heading way beyond 3 degrees. And there lies the truth. When you look at the assets owned by the Exxons and the Chevrons and the Glencores, and look at what they plan to develop, this is why the registry will remind policymakers, remind people working on climate, exactly what is happening in the real world, the financing that is happening nearly all the time. I went to the Glasgow COP, maybe some of you were there. There was a coal IPO in London during the COP. Do you remember that? 6 times oversubscribed. Did you see that? Because we're living in this disconnected world. So where Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor and the Global Registry wants to be is a policy neutral gathering of analysis and facts and information that anyone can download. And we will expand as we use it. It's not a static, it's like a library. We're adding books every day, new information, new analysis that you can pull off the shelf. Thank you very much for coming. And you're going to hear a little bit more about what we've got planned and in store.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for the panel. Thank you, Sunita. I'm going to talk a little bit about the registry as we have it at launch. Let's start with the problem. The problem is, just looking at proven reserves, we have between 7 and 8 times the amount of fossil fuel reserves that fit comfortably within the IPCC's 1.5 degree 50% budget. And note, I'm just talking about reserves. I'm not talking about the resource base that sits under that, or all of the continued investment in fossil fuels to convert those resources to reserves. Now, that's not good for the carbon budget. That IPCC number is 500 gigatons as of 2020. We went through a pandemic where demand slowed, and we still managed to burn through 20% of that approximately to the present day. So it shows we've got a significant issue. You can see on the next slide here, these are the amount of emissions in various IEA scenarios. And when we would break that IPCC budget I just mentioned, and you can see between the net zero scenario, which is the most aggressive on climate, and the least robust, which is the stated policy scenario, we pretty much burned through the budget this decade. That doesn't mean that they're all the same. What it means is that's how small of a window we have. And in the scenarios here where we actually do better, it's only because of drastic cuts in the following decade and massive amounts of carbon capture and sequestration in out years. And what that means is we've got to deal with this problem now. And the elephant in the room is the continued production of fossil fuels. And this gets to the question of transparency. We have not been held to account for fossil fuel global usage. One obstacle to this is the lack of data. We understand the global picture, we just looked at it, but we lack data at the level at which decisions are made. The level at which decisions are made are the decision to license, the decision to explore, the decision to sanction a project, and then ultimately to develop that project. And potentially, even after a project has been developed, to allow that project to expand. Those happen at the field level, and they happen outside of a public and transparent purview. The registry is the first step in filling this gap. But at launch, what you're going to see is that the registry also reveals that we lack a lot of this data. We have comprehensive coverage at country level. We have coverage of about 75% of the fields globally when you average across coal, oil, and gas. But of that field level coverage, only 15% of it, on a production basis, all these numbers, comes from regularly updated assets. That means the vast majority of it we've had to cobble together from different sources, thanks in large part to our friends at Global Energy Monitor. This demonstrates the need to have a single transparent database that can be used by civil society and governments alike. What's particularly interesting about this, though, is that most fossil fuels are developed in a public-private partnership. So it's not like this information necessarily is or has to be private. Governments can go a long way towards making sure that a sufficient amount of this information does in fact become public. Let's talk a little bit about the goals of the registry. There's really 3 that we've put forward here. I could probably break this up into other goals, but the 3 goals really are: first, for the ability for governments to report and verify their own data in the registry in order to contribute to global transparency. The second is an open source, fully transparent, and importantly, policy neutral tool that tracks reserves, production, and emissions at country and project level. And the third is a database for governments, decision makers, investors, civil society, and researchers alike to use to address in their own ways the fossil fuel overhang. Let's look a little bit at some of the data. So data is drawn from a wide range of sources. First, from structured databases that include approximately 33 from national or subnational governments or international agencies or authoritative parties like the EIA, companies like BP, and government databases from places like Nigeria, Mexico, Canada, Norway, and others. Because we are focused not just on the reserves, but the emissions embedded in them, we've had to look at data related to translating that, and there's other issues around data visibility there as well. And we've pulled from sources like the IEA and OPG, a research group that's looked extensively at this. Where data isn't available, we've relied on Global Energy Monitor to do a tremendous amount of bespoke collection in this regard. And importantly, I should say that what we look at is not that this is original information. We are looking for public information and even bringing in multiple data sets when we find them. We want this to be effectively a database of databases and allow people to be able to compare differences between the groups. The result is a global snapshot, a composite picture of the world's fossil fuel reserves, production, and emissions. We start here at the globe, and then through the registry, as you'll be able to see, we drill down to country, and then finally to field level. Here's one of the first screens that we have at country level. I'm going to walk you through what a few of the things are and a few of the issues that motivate some of the information that you see here. The point of this, of course, is to create a common data set to foster discussion between policymakers and others on managing this issue. So to point out a few relevant features, in the top left, you can see GWP 100. So that's global warming potential. And this is lets the user select the warming potential of methane, a particular topical issue today. If you shift that number, which is typically uses a global warming potential of methane of 100 to global warming potential of methane of 20, GWP 20, you will increase the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by about 15% of all these assets in the database. So one technical little change, one very material impact on the overall carbon budget. But this lets you select that, the user to select that information. We also include different sources for production estimates, as I mentioned, and that's in the second drop down. So here it's EIA, it could be BP. There may be, as we go, certain local data sets that we're also able to incorporate. Those are the two that we have now. So you can also see the variation both in production and reserves information between those data sets. The circle chart here reflects the emissions associated with coal, gas, and oil production in country, broken down not by scope 1, 2, and 3, which you're probably accustomed to, but by pre-combustion and combustion. We need to do that because the scopes are really focused on whether something is within a particular entity's province or not. It's focused on essentially the demand side. We need to make this sensible for the supply side, and the two decision points for the supply side are what's happening in the process, what emissions are coming out in the process, and what emissions are coming out in the combustion. Subsequent iterations may also contain additional detail, breaking down the different points in the process as well. And the chart on the right here basically reflects variance in the numbers that we have, so uncertainties about the emissions associated with the supply. You see a big band, that means there's a high amount of uncertainty, and we need to get information to help shrink that. If you see a small band, conversely, that means there's pretty solid confirmation of what's in there. Let's go to the next slide. This is one of the key charts also on the country level, the last one I'll show you today. This is basically combining historical production data with reserves data matched against a given scenario. Okay, in this case, this is the SDS scenario used for Norway's production. So this is what the SDS would project the country would produce over time going forward. It's important to note that this is both not our forecast. This is from the SDS. We're just trying to show what it would mean. And second, we're not suggesting it's a production forecast either. Reserves aren't just produced sequentially in this way. So this is to illustrate, though, the volumes and how long those volumes would last at those given production levels. The reality is, you know, if you were a company, you'd be thinking about what the expected ultimate recovery from the field was, regardless of the reserves. But this helps illustrate, you know, whether we have an overhang or not. Obviously, the more robust decline you have in this scenario, the longer the reserves would last. Let's go to the next one. Besides the country level, we also have field level information. So this just begins to show some of the applications that you can get from the registry. In this case, we're looking at, you know, well, imagine this, I guess I should say, you know, as carbon and methane pricing gains prominence, precise field level data on emissions will become more important. So here we have some field level emissions data, in this case from Norway. This is of the 118 fields in Norway, the top 10 most emissions producing fields. Seeing this provides an instant grasp not only of historical emissions, but also potentially where they will be going forward. So you could suppose that the Norwegian government, let's say, wanted to create a plan to abate 1 billion tons of CO2e in production from current levels by 2030. So they want to find a way to reduce emissions. This is a starting point for a discussion about that. And the important thing to note is this is all going to be public, right? So let's say the Norwegian government didn't want to have that conversation. Well, because it's public, they would give the opportunity for opposition politicians, activists, think tanks, and others to initiate that conversation. And the point is, when we have transparency, we have the ability for other groups in civil society to also participate in addressing these issues. Here's another example that we came up with just because Congress managed to pass a law on this that had an interesting provision. The Inflation Reduction Act, which will by 2024 impose a methane price of $900 a ton of methane going forward, and it will escalate over time. So this fee is substantial, and it instantly creates a multi-billion-dollar set of liabilities across the United States. The pie chart on the left creates a ballpark showing the potential liability if all methane emissions are included. And the one on the right shows the number of assets in the registry already that could potentially be subject to that. We only have 7 states currently, but other states are being added even as I speak. Interestingly, the IRA includes an exemption for fields that only have, less than 25,000 tons carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. But the registry is going to enable you over time to be able to figure that out. So who's going to be impacted by this law? The point of the registry is to be able to be iterative, nimble, and responsive so that as policy measures like this develop, we'll be able to provide information that can help understand what the implications of those policy measures are. We've already begun to do some of these, and I can show you very quickly on my penultimate slide, which is, I give you 3. So we have worked with the Extractives EITI, the Transparency Initiative. I'm forgetting what the first I stands for data combining data that they have on tax take, so the amount of revenue that governments receive from the production of fossil fuels in their country, and comparing that with the emissions data that we have in the database. And what it shows is that there's actually a wide range from $5 a ton CO2 in the UK up to about $100 a ton in Iraq. So a very wide range. Now, the point is not to then say, well, someone should do this or that, but to be able to deliver information that can be the fodder for policymakers and others to manage and think about this problem. We were also approached by an asset manager, Nordea Asset Management, to be able to talk about, well, what can you do with methane? We want to engage with companies on methane. Well, we do have methane estimates. So one of the things that we did, we said, okay, well, we can use our country level methane estimates, and based on the production by various fossil fuel producers, provide to you information on what we expect their methane emissions are. Importantly, a lot of these companies that they're engaging with don't actually disclose that information. But now we can offer an alternative and a gap fill, which admittedly won't be perfect, but it's better than nothing, could be the starting point for that conversation. The third thing is that we've also worked with the leading Excel tool developer to be able to produce an Excel tool that will let you model carbon prices based on the emissions from individual projects. So you can download into the tool very easily with a click of a button, 1 or more projects from the registry, and then run whatever carbon price forecast you want on it to look at what the financial impact would be on that particular project. And let me just conclude with the 5 key things that I think you should think about and take away from on the registry. First is that it's an open source database of fossil fuel projects. You'll be able to download the information in any way that you want. The second is it's a policy neutral tool. Yes, it looks at scenarios, but it's going to have many scenarios in there. And the point is to be able to show what they mean to allow people to make decisions. The third is that it serves governments, decision makers, investors, civil society, and researchers. The fourth is that it's really about promoting transparency of fossil fuel supply. And the last is that it's dynamic, and that it will improve over time, particularly with feedback and comments, and we very much welcome that.
Thank you so much, and huge congratulations, Rob and Mark. To our audience here in New York and our considerable audience that's also joining us virtually, please be considering questions and what's on your mind while we explore some of the possibilities and contributions from our esteemed panelists. Just before we turn to the panel, I did want to share a comment which has come in from Eamon Ryan, who's the Irish Minister for the Environment, Climate and Communications. Eamon was unfortunately unable to join us today and sent his regrets, but he did ask me to share his government's support for the registry. And he specifically noted that accurate data is needed to inform policy decisions, and open, transparent data builds public confidence in those policy decisions. The work of the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels to fill in knowledge gaps and provide an open and accessible data platform is welcome, and it will assist in furthering the climate conversation as we transition towards a net zero future. So let's hear more perspectives from our distinguished panel. Ms. Anderson, can I start with you? UNEP has rightly been lauded, of course, for your pioneering work on the supply side agenda in the form of the production gap report. And I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how the registry will build on the work of that report, and of course, to share your reflections on the registry more generally. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sunita, and thank you both to Carbon Tracker as well as to NRGI for arranging this. And let me apologize. I have 9 minutes left and then I will have to leave. But I'm sitting here and saying, this is so interesting what you're saying. I really want to hear it, but I have to apologize in advance. I have to go and meet with the minister. But look, I mean, this is really critical. Transparency is everything. And I think the numbers that you have presented bears this out. I mean, you know, we sometimes speak about the atmosphere being this bathtub, right? And as you know, any bathtub, you pour more water in it, at some point it will overflow. We pour about 55 gigatons in 2020, which was a COVID year, into that bathtub. At 300 or 400 gigatons, it flows over, right? If we're talking 1.5 degrees. So that means that we have just 8-9 years and we are gonna just whiz past that 1.5. So transparency in what is actually happening becomes very real. Now, at the same time, and this is something this audience needs to co-own, and that's something that I don't always think that we do. Chad, that beautiful country in just under the Sahel, 6.4% to modern energy, and yet they sit on gas supplies. South Sudan, 7.2% access to modern energy, and yet they sit on oil. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't exploit their oil. I'm saying that unless we find other solutions to these countries, they will. And not that that's going to be the bigger emission factor, because clearly it is not. 86% of all emissions come from the G20 countries. So there's no issue here. But it is easy to sit in New York City and say these things, but when you see your child dying at a hospital because there is no electricity, it's a real issue. So global solidarity, climate finance, gotta be on your agenda as well, because otherwise it's on the too easy list, right? But look, the point about the carbon tracker is absolutely brilliant, because it will take this stuff from the sources that we heard, and it will put this available for all to use. Not skewing it in one way or the other, being policy neutral, but just putting the facts out there. And I think that is what we at UNEP have tried to do. We know that our energy consumption is not reducing, it is still growing, right? We know that during the COVID years, more exploration, and our production gap report, I could reel off all the numbers, but you know, the bottom line is more coal, more oil, more gas, and the percentages are available in the report. And that just simply does not compute. It doesn't compute when you look at Pakistan, where 1/3 of the country is inundated, where the harvest has been washed out, which you see not just in Pakistan, but which you see over and over again. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, and we are seeing the 4th year drought. a drought that is devastating the Horn of Africa, that is really causing very serious impact. The production gap report that we put out, which tracked, I think it was the 18 largest oil producers, some surprising ones in there that you might not think of as oil producers. So it wasn't just the G20, included countries like Malaysia and others that are significant producers, caused quite a lot of concern in certain quarters. I think I've had more public statements about this report than many of the others report, but having this data out in the public domain, it's based, we published the production gap report based on government sources, purely their own government sources. So it wasn't even other people's sources about them. And based on that, right, 240% more coal than would be in compliance with 1.5, 57% more oil, and 71% more gas. So clearly gas is increasing for all the reasons that we understand I don't know that we know. But we, as I can't remember whether you used that figure, but our numbers said when we issued this that $300 billion in new funds towards fossil fuel. So there's verifiable, transparent, comparable data and information on fossil fuel will be a significant, will make a significant difference. It will help, I believe, promote a government buy-in, number one. And that's very important because, yeah, either by voters voting government buy-in into government, if it's not there already, or by simply the government already having a line and having to toe the line, because you can't whistle and chew gum at the same time. And if you're making commitments in COPs but not living up to them, that doesn't work. It'll help set a global baseline of here we are now in the production, your futures are thus, and it doesn't compute with where we want to land on climate. It'll help also align the fossil fuel production with the climate goals, and of course, produce some sort of equitable planning, right? Don't leave the Chads out of this conversation. Figure this out and put pressure so that investments could go in to these countries that are suffering from extreme energy poverty and absolutely need solidarity and do not have access to technology and will need that, whereas they could easily get access to what's right under their feet, right? What are we going to do for them? And obviously, these kind of numbers will also, if countries live up to their commitment and all the promises that they've made, actually make investor certainty much clearer, because you can tell what is likely to happen and therefore should make that clear. So we really, really think that this is interesting, and we salute you for this work. It is the first ever full transparency, open source, available to all kind of tool. And as you build it out, we from UNEP will be mining it for every bit that we can find so that we too can use it. And with that, my team is making eyes at me that I think I have to go, but I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anderson. I think you summed it up nicely when you said transparency is everything. And as you said, it is what we do with that information and part of the global conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you again. No apologies. Thank you for being here. I wonder now if we can turn to Ms. Schwenk and to hear, as I was coming in, you and I were chatting and you were expressing so much excitement and enthusiasm for the launch of the registry. So we'd just love to hear in your own words, how do you see the registry contributing to climate action in this moment?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. I've really been incredibly enthusiastic about joining this panel. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation of a fantastic initiative. And I think actually this is the kind of open data that we really need in these challenging times. I don't need to tell anyone in this room or in the virtual room out there joining us that the times are challenging with respect to climate action, with respect to the climate crisis. We're way off the 1.5 degree path, but the world has become a lot more complex when Russia decided to invade Ukraine in late February. and the ensuing energy crisis, which has also provoked a food crisis, and which is just adding multiple crises on top of the climate crisis that we already have. Now, there are very tough decisions to be taken by governments, and actually even in a country like Germany, we suddenly have to discuss, at least for a few years to come, the question of affordable access to safe, secure supplies of energy, so which we wouldn't have thought possible only a year ago, I think. So tough decisions, and what do we need in order to be able to take tough and intelligent decisions, we need data. Now, none of us in the government, and I'm sure that goes for every government around this planet, has in their drawer a plan for a situation like this. We don't. And we also don't have in our drawers ready-made data that cover all this complexity that we have to deal with right now. So I really welcome this initiative, and I'm sure that we will profit from it, actually. And what is all the more important is that it's transparent data, because it's only transparency that that will help building trust that governments actually do their homework, that they are actually serious about implementing their climate goals, even if the times are tough. We're convinced that climate action is the answer to the energy crisis that we have, even if it is a hard time at the moment to take the right decisions, but we need to take this crisis as a wake-up call to accelerate and improve on our climate action. And for that, we actually need all stakeholders. And this is why it's very important that your project actually makes data transparent and open. And we in Germany have, well, we did issue an agenda for sustainable digitization only in 2019. So this is something that fits perfectly with our belief and our legislation actually also, that environmental data has to be open, and that there has to be access, universal access to that kind of data. We're trying to provide environmental data as well in Germany as the government, both at the federal level, also at the lender level. But I think you might be doing a lot better job than we are, or at least you have a different kind of data, and we have to throw all that work together. So tremendous work will help us all in facing the complexity of this world. And I'm sure we'll have more of a discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Schwenk. Maybe just a follow-up question around just transition. You spoke of the myriad crises that we are facing around the world. And of course, not all countries do have the same resources that Germany has in order to cope with these crises that threaten progress towards the Paris climate goals and also, of course, towards the SDGs. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about your government strategy to address the question of just transition.
Yes, thank you very much. We are a country that has committed to becoming climate neutral in 2045 already. So that is quite ambitious. And we are, what I think is sometimes not realized, we have introduced one of the largest energy reform bills ever this year, and have just adopted legislation this summer that will boost our energy transition. So we will have our renewable energy share in the power sector up to 80% by 2030. We will, as I said, become carbon neutral by 2045. We also have targets for 2030 and 2040, so 65% by reduction against 1990 by 2035, 88% reduction compared to 1990 by 2040. We've committed now to a nearly decarbonized power sector by 2035 and a predominantly decarbonized road sector by 2030. So yeah, we have actually made a lot of efforts now to also accelerate our permit procedures. And yeah, so accelerating our energy transition is really a huge priority for this government. And I'm stressing this because at the moment there is, I think, a misperception of German policy, because with our former dependence on Russian gas supplies, we have now taken the tough decision to bring a few coal power plants actually back into power generation. And we've been criticized for that. And people have asked me a number of times, how do you actually reconcile that with your policy of becoming climate neutral by 2045 and of phasing out coal by 2030, which is still our aim? Well, I want to actually tell everybody this is a limited measure. So at the moment, yes, in order to become independent, in order to be able to cover the next winter and the winter after that, we have to yeah, take these tough decisions and use fossil fuels more than we intended to. But we've set clear sunset clauses, for instance, on using these coal power plants again. This is only 2 years, a 2-year period. So this is March 2024, full stop. So we are sticking to our climate goals. But you were asking me just energy transition. Yes, we have to take along all our population. Even in Germany, people will face harsh winters, and costs have risen enormously. More than 50% of the households in Germany heat with gas. And yeah, even in Germany, as a rich country, there are actually people who have to make ends meet, and will find this relatively tough next winter. And yeah, so hard times ahead, but climate action, that is actually our firm belief is the solution and shouldn't be the victim of this crisis.
Thank you so much. Maybe if I can ask one follow-up question. So it's very useful to hear about the plans for the domestic transition within Germany. And as we heard from Ms. Anderson, there are, of course, the considerations in countries around the world, especially those most vulnerable, as we heard from Mr. Kofi as well. And so I'm curious if you could talk a bit more about Germany's support internationally and what you see as a potential role there and how the registry might help.
Yes, a very good question. Well, first of all, Germany is committed to raising our international finance for climate action, and that is both mitigation and adaptation. So we've committed, well, as you know, we are the G7 presidency this year, and at the G7 summit, we committed to raise international climate finance from Germany to 6 billion and by 2025. So we are very committed to making sure that not only we can accelerate our energy transition, but rather to encourage, help, support other countries to meet their national decarbonization strategies. So yeah, we're doing this with our development cooperation. We're doing this with our international climate initiative. I've just spoken this afternoon, right now, before I came here, to our partners who are administering the NDC partnership that helps other countries develop their NDCs, have them implemented. So we want to support other countries in defining their NDCs, their long-term strategies as well, and make sure that energy transition, climate action actually gets the finance it needs. Because it's not us only who are facing tough decisions, but as Inge Anderson said, countries that actually do have a wealth of reserves of fossil fuels. I think for them, it's very important to see that it can be worthwhile also financially to let their fossil fuels in the ground and that they can count on us to, make them invest in other economic possibilities.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now turn to Mr. Muffet, who is joining us remotely. Mr. Muffet, welcome and thank you so much for being here with us today. Now, you've done a lot of thinking around mechanisms and the governance of fossil fuel supply. And I'm curious if you could talk a bit about what you think the unique added value is of the registry in your view. Mr. Muffet, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I think that for me, the value of the registry links into that fundamental question of what we mean when we speak about the need for a just transition. The language of just transition is used frequently and I think significantly. But a just transition, a fundamental prerequisite of a just transition is acknowledging that a transition needs to occur. We cannot have a just transition until we admit to ourselves that a transition needs to occur. And as I think the statistics that Mark and Rob shared at the beginning of this webinar demonstrate all too clearly, that acknowledgement is not occurring. And it's not simply a matter of the acknowledgement not occurring in the global South. That acknowledgement is not occurring in boardrooms. It is not occurring in capitals in the OECD and beyond. And I think this registry can play a really important role in reversing that state of affairs. When the IPCC released its report, the report of Working Group 2 earlier this year, one of the things that it acknowledged, one of the things that it warned very clearly is that going beyond 1.5 degrees, even temporarily, will lead to catastrophic losses to human communities, to biodiversity ecosystems, losses that cannot be recovered. And so I think in light of that, part of the value of the registry, particularly when we begin getting down to the project level, is it helps us compare and contrast what companies, what industries are saying to the world about what their plans are, what they're saying to their investors about what their plans are, and what their reserves show, what their reserves put on their books. Because when a company is continuing to build reserves in the face of what we know about the urgent realities of climate change, one of two things are taking place, and only one of two things. One is that the company is assuming that the world will fail to respond to the climate crisis, and it is actively and intentionally investing in climate disaster. And that is not only immoral, but irresponsible and likely violation of a number of human rights standards. The only other option is that the company is investing in building out massive reserves that, if it were critical, if it were realistic, it would recognize can never be exploited. In which case, the fundamental question arises, is this a responsible investment pathway? And so acknowledging those reserves at the corporate level is, I think, a critical precursor to assessing how companies are aligning their business models, aligning their business plans with the stark realities of the need for a just transition. When we look at the national level, I think that the registry serves two very important purposes. One is, I think that it helps to belie the myth that I see many national capitals and subnational governments promoting, that they will be the government to sell the last barrel of oil. And I think part of the power of a registry, part of the power of showing that enormous disconnect between what we have and what we can afford to burn, is to highlight for governments that there is no such thing as that last barrel of oil. And we need to be moving rapidly to get as much of that oil off of reserves and permanently into the ground as possible. And finally, and relatedly, there is the aspect of just transition that speaks to those questions of development. To me, I think one of the fundamental concerns in a world where we're trying to address a just transition on the supply side is that we continue to see not only corporations, but many governments and development finance institutions actively encouraging countries in the global south who are not currently exploiting and extracting fossil fuels, actively encouraging those countries to bet their future, bet their development, bet the long-term livelihoods of their peoples on fossil fuels at a moment when fossil fuels have no future. And I believe that a registry can help us clarify for governments facing that decision that that is not a serious option, and that absolutely development, long-term real development is a critical obligation for all of us, but a farcical, fantastical development that hinges on the development of fossil fuel assets that can't ever truly be burned is neither just nor sustainable, nor is it truly development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now see if there are any questions in the audience. Yes, please go ahead. Yep, mic is just coming around. And if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself.
Sure. Toby Heaps, Corporate Knights from Canada. I noticed, Mark, when you said Wall Street's disconnected from reality, I noticed one of the works of art was winking at you. That one has money and then what is real, up at the top there. Apparently there's a fierce guard dog, a little guard dog but serious question for the whole panel. Who could make the highest impact use of this, like a use case? Who could use this? We're thinking central bankers, trillion-dollar fund managers, bank regulators. Who do you think could use this to diffuse the maximum amount of carbon bond? And how would you imagine them using it?
We have this curious situation where you have a government and it's an energy policy unit working really, really hard on climate and achieving the NDCs and climate ambition. And in the same building, probably in the same department, you've got folks at the other end of the building desperately trying to issue new coal permits and oil and gas licenses. And they probably never meet. And the minister responsible for them probably is not even aware of the contradictions. So for me, the best use is to have a close monitoring of the new permits and licenses being issued by government. So after the Labour government won in Australia, 38,000 square miles of prospecting licenses were issued off Australia for oil and gas development. And it just, points to this contradiction. So at the moment, there's no real way of watching this and monitoring it and challenging it, whether you're a policymaker, a regulator, an investor, civil society, or a scientist. And so the registry tries to address that. And then the other, and I mentioned the figure earlier, and we heard that there's 51 gigatons of CO2 emitted just in the last couple of years, and we've got a carbon budget that runs down less than a decade. And we've got 1,000 gigatons of CO2 earned in the reserves of companies. And by the way, companies don't own most of it. We know governments own the other 3,000 gigatons. So, but there's going to be a lot of assets stranded. There's going to be a lot of unnecessary pipelines, oil wells, and so on, a lot of capital deployed where there will be no return. So I think investors and bankers are also a key audience. But I've also got a sneaking hope, and this is my last comment, that if there is a new coal IPO coming to the London Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, or the same for oil and gas, that the committee responsible for the oversight just stares back at the Global Registry and say, well, look, if we can't burn 3/4 of already what's listed, why are we allowing companies to raise even more money? So an alert signal, a warning signal for regulators that are trying to take hopefully more sensible decisions.
That's a very good question, but frankly, the question is still, I think, wrongly formulated. Sorry for saying that, because all of these people, of course, and all of these organizations would profit greatly from the registry. It's hard to say who would profit most, But yeah, when you, Mark, now just described your imaginary ministry, where you know, in the sort of in the North Wing or in the South Wing. I come from a ministry where I'm grateful to say that we have climate action, energy policy, industry policy, trade policy, all under one roof. And but on the other hand, you're absolutely right. I mean, we spent a lot of time, thank God, speaking to each other about exactly these problems and about exactly the different perspectives that you can have on the same problem. And sometimes we end up arguing about facts, and this shouldn't be the case. So yeah, so if that helps, stopping us arguing about facts, but rather saying, look, let's just check the registry, and we know what the facts are, and then we start again discussing the policy. So we greatly profit from that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Mucka, would you like to come in? What use cases on your mind?
You know, I think I laid that out. I think one of the real values in this, for me as a lawyer, and a lawyer who works in corporate accountability, a lawyer who looks at investment risk, and a lawyer who looks at issues of human rights, is that documenting what those reserves are, documenting them by country, allows us to using a country's own data, using a company's own data, identify those places where there are potentially profound disconnects between the public policy commitments being made, between the national laws and national constitutions under which governments operate, and you know, at the corporate level, between the public proclamations of the companies and what is being demonstrated in their plans. As a lawyer, as a leader of a human rights organization, that sort of disclosure is extremely valuable. And the last thing that I'll say in this regard is, you know, as an organization that, you know, helps to support communities in countries that are being asked to develop fossil fuel resources at the end of the fossil fuel era, being able to highlight and expose the vast disconnect between you know, what resources are declared as reserves and what little we have left to spend, I think can be an aid to those communities who are fighting basically to protect the futures of their own countries, their own communities, as well as our global climate.
Thank you. Rob, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about where this registry is headed. So what's on your mind?
Is it coming through? Okay, there we go. I think the user of the registry is going to evolve, and it's going to evolve for two reasons. One is people are going to get a better understanding of it, and they're going to be able to, and the second is there's going to be better data, and there's going to be a time series of data as we go through this. And so there's going to be more sophisticated use cases over time. So I think the original use cases, the initial ones, are going to be things like gap filling, like what Nordea wanted when they came to us to say, look, you know, we just don't have this data. What can you give us from the registry as a placeholder? But I think you're going to get more sophisticated use cases. You're going to see who's replacing their reserves year over year, despite this climate crisis that we have. We're going to have that information. That's going to be there, right? And that's going to be from authoritative sources. We're going to be able to do more sophisticated things with the data as we get it as well. You know, we are going to include, you know, a module that we're going to be putting in. Right now, we're talking about reserves. So we're talking about from producing assets. Well, what about all the licenses that are being handed out, right? On top of that, that information is going to be coming in as well. There's actually a lot of great data on how many licenses are going to be made available by jurisdictions that are still very active in that space. So as we get that information, I think you're going to start seeing from civil society and private actors as first adopters, moving up into the possibility that government to government discussions can be had about some of these issues.
Mark, I know you're itching to come in, but I just want to ask one follow-up question of Rob. So you just were speaking about other pieces of information like licensing. NRGI has been very actively and attracting other data and making it publicly available, including project level data, but also on contracts and licensing. Can you talk a little bit about the integration of the registry going forward and what types of data you're seeking to be complementary?
Yeah, and you know, and that's the thing I should have answered. The answer to this question relates to this as well, which is that what we're looking for is really to understand what are the use cases out there that people are interested in and push the data in that way. So for example, issues on licenses, we have lots of questions about licenses. Well, what exactly is going on there? How can you get more transparency on that? And, and that's absolutely one of the projects. We're going to try and do a pilot this year that if successful, we'll be able to expand and apply that to all the jurisdictions. So happy to have that conversation further, actually.
Now, of course, there's one group that's got a lot of information about fossil fuel projects, and that's the fossil fuel industry. So you've got whole teams at companies like Shell and BP with their energy outlooks, just writing lots of research and analysis. And I was at the TEDx conference just before the COP last year, and a very senior oil and gas executive gave a speech where all about transparency and disclosure. And so I cornered him with Zep afterwards and said to him, I said, well, would you like to become a partner to the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels? And he said, absolutely not. Because as soon as we disclose what we're doing, you're going to try and stop us producing, aren't you? So no, we're not going to have. So that's kind of some rank. I'm not going to use the word. I nearly use the word hypocrisy. No, we have these conversations in good faith. At least I try to, until you realize, and there was an unpublished paper from the Treasury in the UK that calculates that there's 175 billion pounds of excess profits are going to be made this year and next year by the fossil fuel industry. And that's 175 billion pounds worth of reason not to be transparent about the projects where you're making your money. And that's really what the registry hopes to open up, to have that information in the public domain. I'd love to see you. I will describe them as friends who want to do something about climate, joining us with disclosure about what they're doing. It shouldn't be an NGO funded by philanthropy doing this. It should be the industry. It should be governments, and we should be expanding the work of the work at UNEP, with the production gap. And ours is a library of, you can pull books out of. It's not a spot once a year. It's a live living database. But we hope to be something that governments would end up joining us with, and others to bring this information into the public domain.
Absolutely. And I think this is where mandatory disclosure requirements play such an important role at the global level and also at the national level to really be targeting information that can then be made available. I think, as Ms. Anderson was saying, the UNEP production gap report is based on publicly available data, but imagine if we could have a wealth of additional information out there. I know that we have a lot of questions that are coming in online. So I'm wondering, before we come back to the room, if I could hear from Evgenia, any questions that are coming in online?
Hello. Okay. So we have a question from Simon Taylor. How Germany or other states can avoid ending up encouraging new project development, particularly in the global south, that could end up becoming stranded later or creating vast amounts of new reserves coming onto the market.
Well, that is actually the question, because of course we don't want to create any lock-ins. And this is why, as I've explained, we are actually trying to make sure that whatever we now do to become more independent from Russian gas supplies, that this doesn't create any lock-ins. So this is only really for a very short period of time that we're forced actually to build LNG infrastructure, for instance. And we have made sure that we have sunset clauses on all these actions so that we can't actually produce stranded assets. And when we, well, I travel the world quite a lot, accompanying my ministers sometimes it's only myself. And I speak to people a lot in the framework of our energy partnerships and our energy dialogues. And what makes me optimistic is that actually we have also seen a boost in renewable energies around the world. And we have countries asking us about the development of green hydrogen, especially, but also asking us for support for cooperation on increasing their share of renewable energies, of building up a new industry in that field. And so this, I think, is actually the solution to the whole problem, that we have to make sure that renewable energies, green hydrogen, become an alternative model. And it is a very viable model already, I think, for a number of countries. And this is what we have to make clear, that even economically speaking, you're much better off investing in that area rather than fossil fuels.
No, I completely agree on that. In the last 20 years, we built about 2 terawatt hours of renewable energy, which is equal to all the coal-fired power generation built over the last 100 years. And renewables are growing at about 20% per annum globally, if you look at infrastructure build. So if you do the maths on that, we'll have about 8 terawatt hours by 2030. And that's equal to all the gas and coal-fired power generation. That's just illustrates, that's ENBA figures, that just illustrates the speed really of the clean energy revolution. People talk about, gas being a short-term measure, but actually once you do the permitting and site management and then getting your gas to a gas-fired power, that's 6 or 7 years. And during that 6 or 7 years, you could have built a huge swathe of infinitely cheaper renewables. I mean, gas at the UK is £330 a megawatt hour. Renewables are going to be about 45, 48 pounds a megawatt hour. It's 6 times more expensive to build a gas. So to me, it makes no sense to push gas, oil and oil onto the global south when they could leapfrog to a cheaper, more reliable, cleaner form of energy, which at the end of the day, once you built it, is free. The thing that fossil fuels does, it builds dependency on communities. And that we should be very concerned about. Africa is not one country, it's 40, 45, 50 countries. And you've got a large number of those countries are importers of energy. And of course, it's the exporters are the ones pushing for this dash for gas. Why? Because they want to make other countries in Africa dependent on their imports. So it's not one voice, it's multiple voices. And we should be listening to communities trying to challenge gas being imposed on them in Africa.
Yes, though very much as you were saying, the possibility of renewable energy is there, but that will only come to fruition if the countries in Africa see the kind of climate financing and global support that's necessary to make that choice, as opposed to the other options that are directly in front of them. And so that's a critical piece to the just transition puzzle. I think we have time for one last question in Evgenia. Yes, go ahead.
So there's a question from Paul McLean. How do you account for the production of the state-owned national oil companies in countries where transparency may be challenging?
Well, we don't make it up. That's the first part. But there is, when we look at this data, right, we have, there are other people maybe that have made it up, but they would be the Energy Information Agency, the IEA, BP, and others that produce estimates. Part of what we're doing by creating a registry is for this to be an information forcing tool. So I won't get into some governments that we've started to have discussions with, but there are some that are interested in this and produce fossil fuels that have said, okay, well, how would you like us to disclose this information, right? And so we think that's going to come over time, and we'll be able to get there. But I want to say that there are some places, certainly there are lots of places that are informationally dark. Some of the largest fields in the world are informationally dark. We don't have that information at field level. All we have is what's at country level today. But there are some places that would surprise you. I mean, in the database at field level, we have coverage of coal mines that reaches about 95%, thanks in very large part to the excellent work that GEM did in that area. And that includes, I mean, to get to 95%, you're talking about a lot of big coal producing countries. So, we're trying the best we can, but hopefully by having this, more countries are going to be willing to produce that information because it exists somewhere. It's not unknowable.
Great. Thank you so much. I wonder, Mark, if you want to just offer some closing words, and then we'll have one last word from the panelists before we end.
Well, yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining us in person and online. I know how busy your schedules are during Climate Week. Come and talk to us afterwards about how to use the registry, how to connect. This is an initiative funded by philanthropy, and we want to thank Generation Foundation and Al Gore in particular for their support for the registry. And ultimately, as a public good, we see it will have philanthropic support over the next few years, but ultimately want it to be a tool embraced by international government agencies such as the UN, and that will be a place that everyone can use. So the key now is letting people know about it. So if you have networks, or if you work in a foundation or in a university department, we want it circulated. And I want to see like lots of colleagues pushing out information on the registry in the coming year, just so that all kinds of policymakers and think tanks, and thank you for the Natural Resource Governance Institute and others, and we'll work with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, promoting awareness of this where we can. So thank you again, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much. May I just ask each of our panelists maybe to offer one word that comes to mind when you think of the registry? And Mark, I'm going to start with you because I think you've been thinking about this registry a lot. One word that comes to mind when you think about the registry. Timely. All right, Rob, what's on your mind?
Feedback, because I'd like to get feedback on the registry. There's a place for you to do that.
Great. Carol, one word that comes to mind on your side.
Accountability.
Accountability. And one on your side.
Optimism.
All right, what a note to end on. Thank you all so much. I think what the other words that I've heard today are essential, iterative, nimble, responsive, and brilliant. So congratulations to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please stick around. Take care.